what really made them think about this was when the Indians started figuring out that in European society, you could turn wealth into power. Because in indigenous society, you couldn't do that. You know, I might have more corn than you have, but so what? I have more corn. What am I going to do with that? I might have more beads. That's nice. I can show them off. Everybody's like, wow, he's got a lot of beads. But you know, it doesn't mean I can make anybody do something that they don't want to do. And it was only actually when the Native Americans started going to cities like Montreal and New York, and a lot of them went to Paris, you know, in diplomatic delegations, they started saying, oh, I see. So you created a society where if you have more stuff, you can make people do things they don't otherwise want to do. That's clever. How did you figure that out? Thus they started talking about equality. So if you think about it, you know, when we talk about inequality, we just take it for granted that inequality means power, but it doesn't have to. You know, you can have a society where some people have more stuff and some people have less, and, whatever. It doesn't make any difference. So, you know, really, when we use the word inequality, we're covering up for something much more profound, which is the ability to turn wealth into the ability to push people around. Now, my old professor, when I went to graduate school, I had a professor named Marshall Solins, and he wrote an essay called The Original Affluent Society, where he sort of developed this idea. And he said that the problem with our economics is it's really religion, it's really theology. Because if you look at a hunter-gatherer society, yes, they are rich, because wealth, affluence, is a relationship between what you want, your needs, your desires, and the material means to realize that, right? So if you feel that what you want is like some nice fried fish and to be able to lie back and relax and play games all day, and adequate clothing, you know, so forth and so on. Well, you know, hunter-gatherers have that in abundance. They can pretty much get that in working 2 hours a day. And the rest of it, then they get to enjoy themselves. So basically they all live like rich people in their own terms. And it's only us who have created societies where there's things like poverty, because we've created needs that are by definition things that everybody can't have. And the question is how that happened. And if you think about it, a lot of what Christianity teaches us is that we have infinite desires, which clearly isn't true, right? That's if you're reading like St. Augustine or any of the Christian fathers, when they say this is how we were punished for original sin. We rebelled against God, and therefore our own desires rebel against our own common sense, and we just want more and more and more. So you see the same thing in all the Christian writers, but even in people like Hobbes, when they start inventing sociology, they always say, well, people have an infinite desire for pleasure. Why do they have an infinite desire of pleasure? Because they're miserable. Life is horrible. You know, life is pain. So pleasure is our way of forgetting about pain. We want more and more pleasure. But in order to guarantee our access to pleasure, well, we need property. So we want wealth. And so we want as much of that as possible, because everybody wants as much pleasure, and there's only so much stuff, so we're all competing over that. And then in order to guarantee our access to property, of course, we want power. So therefore, we're going to always be competing for more and more power. So that's why everybody left to their own devices would just be killing each other, and we need to create a government to keep everybody in line. But the interesting thing is that for most of human history, even though that's the way philosophers said people acted, people still didn't act that way. If you look at the Middle Ages, for example, you know, people had a fairly clear idea of what they wanted, and when they got it, they'd stop. This is a famous thing. It's called target incomes, economists call it. So even the way economists describe people's behavior, you want more, you're always going to maximize your utility. It's not what people would do. And in fact, a lot of times, people still don't. They always say this is why it's hard to get a taxi in the rain. The reason why it's hard to get a taxi in the rain is because taxi drivers work until they make a certain amount of money, and then they go home. You know, so even though when it's raining they can make a lot of money, they just go home early. And you know, that's how everybody acted through most of human history. So the question is, what got us to the point where we would act to want more and more and more and more? Of course, Max Weber thought it was a bunch of religious fanatics. You know, it was Protestantism. These people who had convinced themselves that the only proof they weren't going to hell is that they were prosperous. But it's clear of something like that that's been driving people. And if you think about it, we're surrounded by, I think the average person in a society like England, Germany, America sees like 10,000 advertising messages a day. And all of those things are to try to convince us that we are completely inadequate, that we look bad, that we smell bad, that nobody loves us or should love us unless we have more stuff. So if you think about it, if there wasn't a natural urge in us to just stop at a certain point, they wouldn't have to do that. You know, if we were just naturally wanted more and more and more, they wouldn't have to constantly make us feel nervous about ourselves to make us need to consume more and to drive this sort of engine of wealth. So I wanted to end, I guess, by saying, well, what is wealth? I mean, in a way, you could say the Americans were right, the Native Americans. Actually, by any objective measure, they were, because one thing I always thought very significant was the fact that back then they used to kidnap people in warfare, and indigenous Americans did this a lot. They would just grab people and try to raise them as what they considered to be proper human beings. And then they would have negotiations, and like they'd often exchange prisoners. But every single case of an indigenous American being kidnapped and brought up as a European, the moment they let their guard down and weren't looking, those guys would escape it instantly. Whereas half of the Europeans, were kidnapped in Native American societies, they refused to leave. So I mean, if there's any objective measure, which is a happier way of life, I guess they must have been right. So if you look at wealth, I guess true wealth, you could say, by any objective measure, is having enough in relation to what you desire. But I think in our society, we've come to define wealth in a very weird and complicated way. And I was just going to throw this out at the end as a topic for discussion, because I thought, I was looking over the different things that people said in the project, and one of the more striking ones was about Leonardo. If nobody had ever tried to steal the Mona Lisa, would he be so famous? And it's true, that's when the Mona Lisa became really famous, when someone stole it. I was thinking about that when I thought about, remember about a year ago, one of the Kardashians, their diamonds were stolen, and it was a big scandal. And they had how many million was it? It was worth like $1.2 million or something like that. There's a whole, and you think about what it would require to walk down the street wearing something that everybody knows is worth millions of dollars worth of diamonds. You'd have to have all sorts of security, and everybody would have to know you have armed people following around. And I started to realize that a lot of these things nobody ever buys. We know exactly what a painting costs, one of Picasso's paintings that no one would ever buy or sell. And the reason why we know what it costs is because somebody might steal it, right? That's the only reason, it's insured. Same with the diamonds, right? People don't really buy this stuff or sell this stuff very often, but they know exactly what it costs for. So really the thieves actually create the value. Because if there were no thieves, then you wouldn't know how much these things cost. So maybe you could make a case that the thieves, they since their labor of constantly trying to figure out a way to steal the thing actually produces some of the value of the wealth. Maybe they deserve a crack at it, it's fair. It's like a lottery thing. And as a result, someone once suggested that life, there's no scientific definition of life, right? Scientists, it's really not a scientific concept. You don't know whether something is alive or not, like a virus. Nobody knows. So in commonplace thought, we know how to know something is alive. How do you know something is alive? Because you can kill it, right? If you can kill it, it's alive, or it was alive. We can only prove it was alive once it's no longer alive. But it occurs to me you could make the same thing about wealth. Maybe in our society, wealth is something you could steal. If you can't steal it, it's not actually wealth. So I'd like to leave with that thought.
everybody. And yes, so maybe we can now talk together and a question from the audience.
Hello. Hi, I'm Ian. I have a question for David Graeber. You're talking about, I find these accounts of America, the way Americans live to be, like, idealize the point of not being believable. Like, they said, if the chief doesn't want us to do, tells us to do something we don't want, we just laugh them. Why do they call him the chief?
Oh, you want me to answer that? Yeah, I mean, sure. Have you read Pierre Classmen?
No.
Oh, okay. Basically, the way there's a whole tradition of looking at the institution of chiefship in both North American and South American societies. But essentially, what that person was someone who deals with outsiders, who entertains people by making speeches, and who mediates disputes. That's what they do. And what the argument is one way to prevent political authority from emerging is you take the person who's most likely to want that job, set up a job for them, but then make that position so incredibly unpleasant and miserable that and sort of keep them in the spotlight so much that there's no way they can actually turn that into a way of coercive authority. So a lot of people pointed out that Native American chiefs were incredibly great orators. There's all these U.S. soldiers who were basically sent to massacre them would be reduced to tears by their speeches, and they'd kill them anyway. But they would always speak about this, and one reason for that is simply because they had no coercive power. You couldn't make anybody do anything they didn't want to do. So you had to be really convincing. But at the same time, the chief was expected to give everything away. He was like the social. So he's actually the poorest person in the community, regularly speaking. So it's a way of sort of taking the ambitious people, putting them in the spotlight, and then creating a situation where they really couldn't turn that into a form of coercive authority.
Yeah, but are you saying that they were able to organize warfare based on persuasion alone?
Usually, yeah, actually. But usually, if it came to that, there would be a war chief who would only have authority during war. And that would be a different person. That they were very careful to make sure that could not become the basis for any sort of authority outside. And I mean, it depends on different groups have organized it differently. There's almost invariably a clear distinction of functions.
Yeah, it's also very interesting that in these indigenous societies, how education was conducted. They never punished kids until the Europeans teach them how to do that.
Yeah, the Puritans just drove them crazy because they said that people were learning, Indianization, they called it. In fact, settlers only started calling themselves Americans when they started adopting some American habits, such as not beating kids, and this drove the Puritans crazy.
Yeah. And I also have a question to Frank about the end of your speech. Because that's of course one of the major interests of the project that I was doing with kids is how we can imagine a different idea of wealth, and can we imagine that? And so children come up with all kinds of answers for that question. But I didn't really understand because it was very academic. You need to lecture. So can you kind of talk more about communism?
I think this is the question for all of us and the whole mankind. I don't have any idea of a communist society, so I don't have a different idea of wealth and poor, but you can have a different idea of what is wealth and poor when you do it like David Graeber showed, so saying that maybe these two terms didn't really make sense when you look at different societies. So this is what of course it was a kind of Steilvorlage, I don't know the English term, when I said, oh, look at former societies, how poor they were. Of course they were not poor and we are incredibly rich, but these societies simply had a different idea of what is wealth and a different idea of what is poorness. And so it was, in the end, it should be a Steilvorlage for my own talk, because I wanted to show that our wealth is only the other side of our poorness, because we have to work, we have nothing else than to sell our labor power, etc. And so I think, so the prophet is, okay, I don't know the English term, the prophet is the turned over historian, so I don't know how wealth and poorness in a future society would be totally different, but we can already see that richness and poorness in other societies were so different that we don't even in a strict categorical sense can use this term to speak about, I don't know, indigenous people and say, oh, they were less poor or less rich or whatever. They simply had a different idea of, I don't know, life or living and so on.
But then it's,
you know, I sort of like, partially agree with you, but partially also disagree. And I think, yes, you have this kind of idealist vision of the indigenous communities. But what I want to say is that I think you can also look at poverty and wealth in kind of more objective or physical or maybe energetic terms. So I work with physicists, you know? So you can look, like if you look at the human person, if this person needs about 10 megajoule of energy per day just to sustain the body function, and everything above this is then to kind of express your lifestyle, And if you look at the human history, for a very long time, people were living just kind of on this border, like they were getting enough food just to kind of maintain the body functions and to survive. But then with agrarian revolution, they started to appropriate more energy, but kind of going beyond this kind of 10 megajoules of this kind of, it's called endosomatic energy to sustain the life body functions. With the agrarian revolution, they started to use like the some energy to also have some animals, and do some labor with the animals on the field and so on. So they were using additional around 10 megajoules of energy to kind of sustain the animals and so on. But then with the Industrial Revolution, in the 60s, 70s, people started to use much more of that energy, and they needed about like 10 times more than that, So it means like except those kind of 10 megajoule of energy that you need every day to sustain your body functions, you need about 10 times as much to sustain your lifestyle, to heat your house, to drive your car, and to have power for all kinds of equipment that you have at your household, and so on. And this is kind of interesting if you look at in these terms, because there are still people today on the earth. It's like a few million people who are suffering hunger, who are kind of in the metabolic terms, they are sort of like energetic or metabolic underclass, because they don't get enough food to sustain their body functions. They are suffering hunger. Yeah, and I thought, this is really interesting. And if you look at those differences, there are those kind of huge metabolic differences that we consume in different world regions. Yeah, and just to kind of to link it back to Aristotle and the slaves, so and it's actually not me, but there's this term also like energy slaves, So if you, as I said, so to maintain your lifestyle today, you need about work of about 10 persons that would, somehow do things for you, If you look at the kind of those energetic purpose, so how much energy you need to kind of drive your car, to provide power for your washing machine and dry washer and whatever else you have in your household, you need energy of about 10 persons per day, and also economic the energy slaves, that work for you in the Western societies, yeah. But there are still those people, the societies where people use much less in developing countries, and there are still those who suffer, this extreme poverty. So I thought, this is kind of interesting to look in kind of those energetic terms at. They kind of provide more objective measures, like what do you need to sustain your life.
David, you should answer because you're writing a book now about David Congrove.
Oh, God, that. I was going to not be too argumentative. Yeah, I mean, there are people who try to look at objective measures such as calories, energy use, so forth, and so on. Is this working? Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't really need it.